start it now. All right, now it is being recorded. Okay, so as I said, all of the videos I play will be in the appropriate folder. So for the endocrine system today, you can find any video I play in the endocrine system folder on Blackboard. Okay, so after we talked about what a hormone was, we then talked about how there are two hormones have two chemistries. Either they can be a steroid hormone or they can be a non-steroid hormone. If they're a steroid hormone, they pass directly through the plasma membrane into the cell, bind receptors, and then they attach directly to the DNA, and they can turn on genes, turn off genes. If, on the other hand, they are non-steroid hormones, they can't pass through the plasma membrane, so they bind to receptors on the outer surface of the plasma membrane, and they turn on second messengers. And I said that for every hormone we talk about, you have to know its mechanism of action. Does it work through second messengers, or does it bind directly to the DNA? And so you need to know which are the steroid hormones, which are the non-steroid hormones. And there are only 6 steroid hormones that you have to know. So if you know those 6, then you know that all the others work through second messengers. And of course, there's always exceptions, and that exception, of course, is thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, even though it's non-steroidal, works through does not work through second messengers. It binds directly to the DNA, and that's because it has specific channels that lets it in. Okay, and then we talked about, okay, well, what causes hormones to be secreted? And basically all stimuli or changes fall into 3 categories. Either it's the nervous system, it's some substance in the blood, or it's some other hormone. Okay, and that's where we left off. So I want to pick up where we left off. We talked about what stimulates secretion of a hormone. What about how hormone release is controlled? Well, what shuts it off? In most cases, almost all cases, it's negative feedback, right? As the hormone levels in the blood rise, it feeds back onto the glandular cell, causing a decrease in secretion of that hormone. And if you have forgotten what negative feedback is, here's just a reminder. Negative feedback works like a household thermometer. You open the window, drops the temperature. In response, a receptor detects that drop in temperature, communicates that information to the control center, your thermostat. Because the set point's at 70 and the temperature has dropped lower than 70, it activates the effectors, which are your heaters. Heaters come on, they bring the temperature back up to 70. That removes the stimulus that caused the effectors to come on in the first place. Okay, so hormones are typically self-limiting. Their secretion decreases further secretion of that hormone. Okay, alrighty, so what we're now going to start doing is talking specifically about different hormones. And if you look at your review sheet for your next exam, you're going to see under the endocrine system that for most of the hormones that we talk about, this is the information you're going to need. You're going to need to know what organ or tissue releases that hormone. Where is that organ or tissue found in the body? We're not covering the endocrine system in lab, so I want you for lecture to know in general where it's located. Okay? I want you to know the target organ or tissue for that hormone. What stimulates its secretion? What are its effects? What is its chemistry? Is it steroidal or is it non-steroidal? And if you know its chemistry, you should know its mechanism of action. Does it bind directly to the DNA? Does it work through second messengers? And lastly, what regulates its secretion? In other words, Is it negative feedback or is it positive feedback? And honestly, except for one hormone, it's always negative feedback. Okay, so as we go from each hormone, right, take note of all of this information because this is what you need to know for each hormone. And in fact, I emailed you this document that provides these tables for each hormone that we're going to cover, right? So you can fill this in either while we're covering the material or um, after lecture. Okay. Alrighty, so what I'm going to do now is talk about a couple of specific hormones, and then I'm going to pause and answer questions. So those of you who have questions, just hold them for now. I will get to them. Okay. So here are our learning objectives. First, we're going to describe the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And then we're going to discuss the hormones produced by the hypothalamus that are stored and released by the posterior pituitary gland. And those are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, also called ADH. Okay, so first let's talk about the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And you've learned both of these from lab, right? So here you have the hypothalamus. If you remember, it's located in the diencephalon, extending from the hypothalamus via this little stalk called the infundibulum is the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland, unfortunately, we've sort of misnamed it. It was named before we really had an appreciation for what it was and what it did. Really, the pituitary gland is not really a gland. Well, it sort of is. The anterior pituitary gland contains glandular tissue. The posterior pituitary gland really contains nervous tissue. And so it's really in total not a gland, and it's really two separate organs, right? But for this class, we're going to refer to them as the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. I don't know if you remember, but do you remember the sella turcica, that sort of indention in the sphenoid bone? Well, that sella turcica surrounds and sort of snuggles the pituitary gland. So a lot of times you'll hear the pituitary gland referred to as the master gland. And indeed, it controls a lot of organs and other endocrine glands and organs in the body. So I don't want to dismiss its impact on the functioning of the body. But the pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus regulates the pituitary gland. So really, it's the hypothalamus that's really the master gland, even though you'll hear people in text talk about the pituitary gland as the master gland. I sort of think of the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus like, for those of you who are Star Wars geeks like me, you can appreciate this. Those of you who aren't, right, just nod your head and just say he's a Star Wars geek. So the pituitary gland to me was like Darth Vader, right? Before we learned there was an Emperor Palpatine, right? Emperor Palpatine would be like the hypothalamus, right? We thought Darth Vader was like, you know, the ultimate bad guy, right? He was controlling everything, and then we learned, oh, actually he's being controlled by Emperor Palpatine. So hypothalamus is like Emperor Palpatine, and Darth Vader is like the pituitary gland. Just humor my Star Wars geekdom, will you? Okay, so as I said earlier, the anterior pituitary gland is composed of glandular tissue. You're going to learn it produces 6 very important hormones. The posterior pituitary gland is actually composed of nervous tissue. It does release hormones, but those hormones are actually produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary gland. We're going to start with the posterior pituitary gland because it only releases 2 hormones. And I like to start simple and then slowly build and grow more complex. I find the students just have an easier time following. Okay, so this figure here, I just want to make sure everybody's able to see this. So I'm just gonna, okay, yep, you're seeing what I think you're seeing. Just want to check. Okay, so this is the pituitary gland, and our focus here is on the posterior pituitary gland, here on the right. Up in the hypothalamus, notice we have two nuclei, one color-coded in blue, one color-coded here in green. Well, these nuclei, they're what are called, they contain nerve cells, neurons, but these are what are called neurosecretory cells. They're neurons indeed, and their axons extend down into the posterior pituitary gland. But you know how usually the axon terminals produce neurotransmitters. These instead produce hormones. They produce hormones that pass into the blood here of the posterior pituitary gland. One nuclei produces a hormone called oxytocin, and the other produces a hormone called antidiuretic hormones. And those are the two hormones we're going to talk about. So these hormones are released by the posterior pituitary gland, but they're made in the hypothalamus. Made in the hypothalamus, stored and released in the posterior pituitary gland. Let's talk first about antidiuretic hormone. Now, its name literally tells you what it does. Antidiuretic hormone. A diuretic is something that causes the production of urine. Diuresis is the production of urine. That's what the kidneys do. They produce urine all day, all night. Antidiuretic hormone, as its name implies, decreases the production of urine by the kidneys. Now, why might you want your body to decrease the production of urine? Well, urine is mainly water. It's water with waste products and substances that your body has produced that it doesn't really need or that might be toxic. Why might you want to decrease the removal of water from your blood to make urine? Well, to prevent dehydration. Maybe you're outside, you're working in the sun, you're sweating a lot, and you forgot your water bottle, right? So you want your kidneys to still remove all the waste products and stuff, but not the water, or not as much. So antidiuretic hormone decreases the production of urine. So it decreases urine production. Well, why is dehydration bad? Well, if your kidneys remove too much water from your blood, it will drop your blood volume. If it drops your blood volume, drop your blood pressure. If your blood pressure drops too low, your cardiovascular system cannot supply sufficient amounts of blood to your organs, and you will go into shock and you will die. That's the danger of dehydration. So antidiuretic hormone helps maintain blood volume and blood pressure by decreasing urine production at a time when you're not sufficiently hydrating. What part of the day would you expect your antidiuretic hormone levels to increase? What part of the day, or what might you be doing pretty much every day where you would expect antidiuretic hormone levels to go up because you're not drinking water? Just think for a moment. Or you're not drinking liquids. Okay? Exactly. When you're sleeping, right? When you're sleeping, unless you sleep with a water jug beside you, right? You're going to be producing urine all night long, but you don't want too much water removed from your blood. You'll literally dehydrate at night. So instead, what happens is antidiuretic hormone levels rise at night. Your kidneys produce a concentrated urine, so they remove all of the substances your body's trying to get rid of, but keeps as much water as possible. And that's why when you get up to urinate first thing in the morning, you have this darker colored urine because it's been concentrated to prevent you from dehydrating as you slept. Now, how is antidiuretic hormone stimulated to be released? Well, let's say you're losing more water than you're taking in. That's going to cause your blood concentration or osmolarity to rise. That increase in concentration or osmolarity is detected by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus causes the release of ADH. That decreases urine production, brings your osmolarity back down to where it should be, thereby decreasing further production of antidiuretic hormone. So it's regulated by negative feedback. Okay? Antidiuretic hormone helps maintain blood pressure and blood osmolarity, which is going to decrease further secretion of antidiuretic hormone. Now, guess which commonly consumed drug inhibits or stops the release of antidiuretic hormone? All right. Alcohol. Not so much ibuprofen, but alcohol. Alcohol decreases antidiuretic hormone, and that is what is mainly responsible for the morning after effect, also called a hangover. So you're at a party or you're with some friends, you're drinking a lot of alcohol, you're urinating a lot, you're actually losing more fluid that you're taking in, and then you go to sleep. And while you're sleeping, your ADH levels don't rise to the levels that they normally do. So when you get up in the morning and you go to urinate, your urine is more clear than it should be. You have basically dehydrated overnight. Most of a hangover is dehydration. It's not all of it, but it's most of it. Some of it is withdrawal from the alcohol. Some of it is the breakdown metabolites from your body breaking down the alcohol. One of the best ways to prevent, or I shouldn't say prevent dehydration, but to lessen the morning after effects of alcohol is before you say goodnight, drink some water. So you may know someone who has high blood pressure or hypertension. They typically take diuretics. They basically have the opposite effect of antidiuretic hormone. So they antagonize antidiuretic hormone. There is this medical condition called diabetes insipidus, where there is hyposecretion of ADH. In other words, ADH production is below normal levels. People with diabetes insipidus produce large amounts of urine, and they're thirsty all the time, and they can very easily dehydrate. Now, if this term is confusing you, diabetes insipidus, this is not the diabetes that is related to blood sugar levels. That is diabetes mellitus. So why the name? Well, believe it or not, diabetes means to run through. Insipidus means clear. People who have diabetes insipidus produce a lot of very clear urine, and it's bland if you were to taste it. Okay, don't ask. Right? And so it's diabetes insipidus. So what about diabetes mellitus, which is the diabetes that's related to blood sugar, right? Well, again, diabetes means to run through. Mellitus means sweet. People who have diabetes mellitus, they have, if it's untreated, they have sugar or glucose in their urine. And so if you were to taste the urine, it would taste sweet. And yes, way back when, before we had the diagnostic equipment that we had now, doctors would taste urine to um, to determine if someone had diabetes, and it was sweet to the taste. Now, before you are repulsed by that, right, and you're like, oh, is that dangerous? Normally, urine is sterile. It comes from your blood. Your blood should be sterile, okay? But anyway, I digress. But diabetes insipidus is when someone doesn't produce normal amounts of ADH. They're hyposecretion of it, and they're always thirsty. They have to drink lots of water because they produce large amounts of urine, and they can easily dehydrate themselves. Lastly, antidiuretic hormone is non-steroidal. It's a peptide. You don't have to know it's a peptide, just know it's non-steroidal. Therefore, it works through second messengers. Okay, so you can fill out this table here now based on information that we have covered. So, organ or gland of secretion, posterior pituitary gland. What stimulates it to be secreted? Increase in blood osmolarity or concentration. We said that it's chemistry, non-steroidal. If it's non-steroidal, its mechanism of action works through second messengers. When it's secreted, what does it target? Well, if it's gonna target the kidneys, of course. What does it do? It decreases urine formation or production. How is it regulated? Negative feedback. Okay, so you sort of get the idea how to use this table to make sure you capture everything you have to know about each hormone. Okay, let's talk about oxytocin. As we talk about oxytocin, I'll stop for a moment and address questions. So oxytocin is that second hormone that's produced technically by the hypothalamus, but stored and released in the posterior pituitary gland. What does it do? It causes smooth muscle to contract. Well, what is smooth muscle involved in? Well, you know, smooth muscle is found in, all different parts of the body, but the two areas I want to specifically focus on, the smooth muscle that's in the genital areas, and also that are in the breasts, because oxytocin, we know, is involved in the contraction of smooth muscle, that's involved in sexual arousal as well as orgasm. In fact, it's thought to also be involved in sort of the bonding that occurs after sexual intercourse. It also stimulates contraction of the uterus during labor, and in the breasts, it's what's responsible for the ejection of milk during suckling, during breastfeeding. Oxytocin is a non-steroidal hormone, so it also works through second messengers. And this is the only hormone that we're going to talk about that actually is regulated by positive feedback. Do you remember when we were talking about homeostasis, negative feedback, and positive feedback? We talked about how labor contractions and parturition was the result of positive feedback. So you have this big baby in the uterus pushing on the cervix. That causes pressure receptors to send impulses to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases oxytocin. Oxytocin causes the smooth muscles in the walls of the uterus to contract. That causes even more pressure against the walls of the uterus, which sends even more impulses to the hypothalamus, causing the release of even more oxytocin, which causes greater contraction, longer contractions, more often, and then we just have this cycling of labor contractions until parturition occurs. So with oxytocin, it's regulated by positive feedback rather than negative. Okay, the same thing occurs with suckling. Baby is suckling. There are pressure receptors that detect the pressure from the baby's lips, sends impulses to the hypothalamus, causing the release of oxytocin. That oxytocin causes the ejection of milk, which is going to cause continual suckling, which is going to cause continuous sensory input to the hypothalamus, more release of oxytocin, and that cycle continues until baby is satiated or full and stops suckling. Okay, so positive feedback. Now, something else I want to point out. So the hypothalamus is the control center. It's in the brain. So it's nervous stimuli that's responsible for the release of oxytocin. That is why, if you've ever heard, or those of you who have been mothers, or who are mothers, I guess I should say, may know that women who are currently breastfeeding, they can hear a baby cry, or they can see their baby, or think of their baby, and it can cause ejection of milk from their breast. That is because the hypothalamus is the control center for this process. Okay? So you should also be able to complete that table on oxytocin. What organ or tissue releases it? Posterior pituitary gland. Where is it located? Brain. Target organ or tissue? Smooth muscle. Stimulation of secretion? Neural impulses. Effects causes contraction of the smooth muscle. Mechanism of action and chemistry? Non-steroidal. Works through second messages. Regulation. Positive feedback. Okay, so we'll take this moment, answer any questions you may have. I did see a few that came in. I should say, Eli, you asked, is ibuprofen? I do not know if ibuprofen has an impact on ADH levels. I don't. If it does, it's probably much more subtle than alcohol. Okay, other questions? Just so you are aware, I am going to talk in this discussion. I am going to talk about several diseases or abnormalities like diabetes insipidus. In most cases, you are not going to be held responsible for knowing those diseases. I use them to illustrate the effects of the hormone. Okay, so you will not have to remember diabetes insipidus. Okay, just so you are aware. The only disease you will have to know is when we talk about diabetes mellitus type 1 and type 2, because so many people have it. It's so pervasive in the population here in the United States. That one you will have to know. But all the others, I'm simply sharing with you so that you understand the effects of the hormone. No other reason. Okay, well, we are going to continue to the next hormone. Again, I want to remind you, for every hormone we cover, you need to know the organ of secretion, location, target, stimulation of secretion, effects, chemistry and mechanism of action, and regulation of secretion. All right, so now we're going to move to the anterior pituitary gland. Now, the anterior pituitary gland releases 6 different hormones. We're going to start with growth hormone and prolactin. Okay, so we're moving from the posterior pituitary gland to the anterior pituitary gland. Now, the anterior pituitary gland is composed of glandular tissue. You have cells there, they produce and release hormones. Now, as I mentioned, the anterior pituitary gland produces 6 hormones. 4 of those hormones are what are called tropic hormones. I mentioned tropic hormones in the previous lecture. If you don't remember what a tropic hormone is, it's a hormone that targets other endocrine glands. So it's basically a hormone that causes the release of other hormones. For example, one of those tropic hormones is TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. Its name tells you what it does. It's released by the anterior pituitary gland, it targets the thyroid gland, and it causes the thyroid gland to produce, guess what? Thyroid hormones. Because TSH targets an endocrine organ that then causes it to produce thyroid hormones, TSH is a tropic hormone. The pituitary gland produces 4 tropic hormones. We're going to start with the 2 non-tropic hormones first, which are prolactin and growth hormone. Now, a couple of other things about the about the anterior pituitary gland. As I said, 2 are not have non-endocrine targets, 4 are tropic hormones. All of them are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. All of them are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland in response to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus controls the release of these 6 anterior pituitary glands. The hypothalamus releases hormones, which then target the anterior pituitary gland and causes or inhibits the release of those hormones. Okay? Also, all 6 of these hormones are non-steroidal, meaning they all work through second messenger systems. And the secretion is inhibited or stimulated by the hypothalamus. That's what I said that already. And they all work through regulated by negative feedback. Okay? So for all 6 of these hormones, they're all released by the anterior pituitary gland. They're all released by the anterior pituitary gland in response to the hypothalamus. They're all non-steroidal. They all work through second messengers. So for all 6 of these, they're all the same. The only difference between them is their target tissue and what they do. All right, so this is the image from your book, and that was not supposed to do that. This mouse is like super sensitive sometimes. All right, this is the image from your book. Here's your anterior pituitary gland. It's going to secrete these 6 hormones in response to hormones from the hypothalamus, right? So this is the hypothalamus saying secrete or decrease secretion of any number of these hormones. These are your 2 non-tropic hormones. They do not target endocrine organs, growth hormone and prolactin. These other 4 target other endocrine organs. You have FSH and LH, also called the gonadotropins, because they target the gonads, the testes and the ovaries. You have thyroid stimulating hormone, which we talked about, that targets the thyroid gland. You have adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which targets the adrenal cortex, which then releases its own hormones. So these are the 4 tropic hormones. We're going to start with these non-tropic hormones first. All right, let's talk about growth hormone. Growth hormone probably is the hormone that people are most familiar with. Like if you talk about hormones, people know, oh, growth hormone, right? Because that's the hormone that's responsible for that growth spurt that you had when you hit puberty, right? So how does growth hormone work, right? Well, growth hormone targets many tissues all over the body. Where they have their most conspicuous or the most obvious effect are on cartilage, bone, muscle, and fat. In particular, bone and muscle. Your increase in height, the increase in the length of your arms and legs was primarily due to the increase in the lengths of your bones, and then all the other tissues that were associated with that. Growth hormone is a very important metabolic hormone. In other words, it changes the metabolism that occurs in your body. How so? Well, one, it stimulates protein synthesis. As your bones lengthen, there's collagen in your bones that has to be produced. Also, there's muscle associated with those bones, as you know, that has to increase size and length as your bones lengthen. So it stimulates protein synthesis, and it causes fat in your body to be used as a source of energy in order to spare protein and carbohydrate. So in other words, it shifts your body's use of energy away from protein and carbohydrate, and it shifts it toward fat. Right? That's one of the reasons why when you're younger, you tend to be leaner and meaner. Right? More protein, less fat. Growth hormone is an anabolic hormone. Well, what does that mean? Well, remember, anabolism is the production of larger molecules from smaller molecules, right? So the building of protein from amino acids is an anabolic process, right? Proteins can be hundreds of amino acids long, right? So growth hormone causes the production of protein, so it's an anabolic protein. It causes adipose tissue to be broken down and used as a source of ATP, and spares protein and blood sugar. So basically, it helps maintain blood sugar levels and your lean body mass, your protein, at the expense of fat as the primary source of energy. Right? As I said earlier, the most obvious effects of growth hormones on your skeletal system and the associated skeletal muscles. Growth hormone increases the length of your bones. It also increases the associated skeletal muscles that are attached to those bones. If you recall, growth hormone increases the activity of osteoblasts as well as chondroblasts. It also increases protein deposition and in your bone and cartilage. Right? Remember this figure from the skeletal system. Bones lengthening here due to osteoblasts here and here. Chondroblasts here, and osteoblasts here and here. The bone lengthens as new cartilage is made and old cartilage is replaced by new bone. The cells that perform those two processes are the chondroblasts and the osteoblasts, and growth hormone stimulates the activity of both, which is why you hit puberty, growth hormone levels rise, and then you get the subsequent increase in the lengthening of your bones, thus your growth spurt. All right, so here's some examples of when there is hyper secretion of growth hormone. You get excessive output of growth hormone. You get people who are taller than would be considered normal. Hyper secretion of growth hormone results in a greater than normal amount of bone lengthening, and you get gigantism. Now, this is if it occurs in someone who is an adolescent, right, where those growth plates are still active. What about if it occurs in an adult, like it occurred in me, right? Well, it's not going to cause my bones to lengthen, but if you remember, bones can still widen after you become an adult. And so you get what's called acromegaly, where you get disfiguring of the bones and the associated appendages. Right here, there's abnormal lengthening of the bone, not lengthening. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. There's abnormal widening of the bone, and you can see that most conspicuously in the legs, the feet, and the hands. Okay, lastly, because I know we've run out of time here, what about if you have hypo, or abnormally low secretion of growth hormone? Well, that can lead to what's called pituitary dwarfism. Hypo secretion, you don't get the normal lengthening of the bones, and so you get dwarfism, but you get a body size where the proportions are normal. There's another type of dwarfism called achondroplastic dwarfism, and that's due to that's a genetic defect where the body doesn't produce the normal amounts of cartilage, and so you get someone with like a normal sized body torso, but the limbs are abnormally short. Right? That is not what you see here. This is pituitary dwarfism because of hyposecretion of growth hormone from the pituitary gland. All right. So I shared these abnormalities with you, these disorders with you, to illustrate the effects of growth hormone. Again, you're not going to be responsible for these disorders themselves. Okay, we will pick up from here on Friday. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to hang around for another 10 minutes, so if anyone has any questions, please unmute your mic and ask them, or you can send me a text or chat.